Okay, so we are very excited to speak with Dr. Kate Mornement today about her research. So Dr. Kate Mornement is an applied animal behaviorist, consultant, expert witness, educator, and media spokesperson. She has a PhD in canine behavior from Monash University. Kate's PhD investigated the assessment of shelter dog behavior to determine adoption suitability, particularly in Australia. She has presented her research at national and international conferences and has published 4 papers on her findings in the scientific literature. Since 2004, Kate has consulted pet guardians experiencing behavioral difficulties with their dogs, cats, and parents through her business, Pets Behaving Badly. She has also provided consulting services and professional development seminars and workshops for people who work with animals in shelters, council pounds, veterinary clinics, doggy daycare, local government, aquarium, and research facilities. She has previously worked at RSPCA Victoria, the Animal Welfare Science Centre, Box Hill Institute, and the Anthrozoology Research Group at Monash and La Trobe Universities in research and teaching roles. Kate is an associate editor of the open access journal Pet Behavior Science and an active member of the Australian Association of Pet Dog Trainers, the Animal Behavior Society, and the International Association of Animal Behavior Consultants. So, Kate, Dr. Mortimer, you have quite the resume.
I have a lot of fun doing what I do.
So we wanted to talk to you today about your research, which, as I told you before, is some of my favorite work in this field. As a fellow canine scientist, I think that you've paved the way for some really important future research. But in our case, what's relevant here are the findings and practical implications of your research. So we have a few questions for you about your work. I know that it's been a little while since you did it, but I'm sure it's fresh in your mind still and we'll all come rushing back.
I hope so, although you may remember aspects of it that I'd forgotten because it was a while ago. And I think with COVID, oh gosh, my memory is not as great as it used to be with all the stress of COVID. So forgive me if I forget bits, but I'll do my best.
No problem. Well, again, we're excited to be able to have the opportunity to share the research in this field. So in the field of dog sheltering and dog rehoming to the people who need it, so that they can, keep it in mind, update their policies and procedures, and really operate in a manner that's based on evidence and based on scientific evidence. So with that in mind, first of all, thank you for being here. I don't think I mentioned that bit, but thank you for taking the time to chat.
Well, thanks for having me. It's really cool to be able to talk about research, because something we chatted about offline was, the fact that you don't always know the impact that your research has, and you contacting me and wanting to do this today was something, that made me really happy and demonstrated the importance of research and its practical implications.
For sure, and especially in this field. I mean, I know it because I'm a researcher, but the people who it's really intended for might not know it, and that's why we're here. So with that in mind, we can kind of get on with things. So let me begin by asking you, what is the background to the research and why did you feel that it was necessary to be conducted? I know it was your PhD.
Yeah.
Question.
So I guess the reason I got into this line of work is because I've always loved dogs and pets and animals particularly. And so when I found the Anthrozoology Research Group, which was at the time based at Monash University, Pauline Bennett was running that group and she was my supervisor. So when we got together and discussed about topics that I was interested in that might be good to study, we were looking at shelter dogs. And at the time, we knew that animal shelters had to assess dogs to make sure they were safe to be adopted out. But there was nothing in the scientific literature that said that these assessments were actually reliable and valid. So nothing in the Australian context that said that the assessments being used were actually doing what they were intended to do and were accurate. And so we thought it was time someone looked into that, because the results of the assessment determine a dog's future. They determine whether that dog lives or dies, basically. And remember, this is going back a number of years. This is 10 years ago that a little over 10 years ago that I did this research. So things may have changed in different parts of the world, but we wanted to know what the current state was in Australia with regards to assessing dogs. We also wanted to know what public attitudes were towards shelter dogs, because again, in Australia, we had no idea what the public believed about dogs in shelters, if they even were aware that dogs were assessed for health and behaviour, and if they were aware of that, what they thought about those assessments. So these were the things that we were interested in, and this is what started my PhD journey.
Okay, and then so what would you say are the key findings or results from this research?
Yeah, sure. So there were a few different parts to my research. The first part was would you like me to explain what I
did?
And then and then I'll talk about the results. So the first part was developing a questionnaire for current and potential dog owners. And this questionnaire aimed to understand what their beliefs and attitudes were towards shelter dogs, particularly shelter practices, dog behaviour in general, those sorts of things. Because again, there wasn't anything at the time would allow us to understand that, particularly in the Australian context. And so we did that questionnaire. Then the next part was to review current assessment protocols used in Australia. And that involved me travelling to 11 different animal shelters, observing the assessments, interviewing the staff who were responsible for conducting the assessments to find out what they thought about it and how they felt in terms of conducting the assessment, so their confidence within the tool that they were using, but also within their own ability to accurately assess dogs. And then the next part was developing the behavioural assessment for rehoming canines, or BARC protocol. And that assessment was developed on the basis of what was currently being done in Australia, which the results of the review. So we developed the BARC protocol, and then we wanted to implement it into animal shelters to assess its reliability and validity. And then we looked at the predictive validity of that assessment as well. So we followed up dogs that had been adopted and asked the owners a whole lot of questions about that dog's behaviour to see if the behaviour that we saw in the shelter transferred post-adoption or was the same. So whether we could predict behaviour in the shelter post-adoption. They were familiar with behaviour assessments and health checks, but they still believed that shelter dogs often have behaviour problems. And we know from the research that problem behaviour is one of the more common reasons that dogs are relinquished to animal shelters. Then the next part with the review, the main findings out of the review of protocols currently used in Australia were that everybody was doing something different. They were the protocols were often adapted from well-known protocols used overseas at the time, but none of them that I looked at had been scientifically validated. And also, when I sat down and interviewed the people who were assessing dogs, what I learnt was that their experience and level of training varied a lot, from hardly any to many years experience and lots of workplace training. And the interesting thing was that the more experienced the person was, the less confident they were in their own ability to accurately assess dogs, but also in the accuracy of the tool that they were using at that time. I found that really interesting, and it's a familiar thing I think to people like us, you know, the more you learn, the less you realize you know. It's definitely the case for me. So the review of assessments showed us that everyone was doing something different. None of it was scientifically validated, which meant that, you know, that was a big welfare concern for the dogs in those shelters, because we didn't know if they were being accurately assessed or not. So that was then why we came up with the BARC protocol. We took the most common elements of all those assessments currently being used to try and see if we could prove that it was reliable and valid. So then the next part was implementing the BARC protocol into, I did actually go to a lot of shelters who did want to be involved in my research and train them up how to use it. So the idea was that they would assess dogs using their regular protocol, but also the BARC protocol, so that we could get an idea of how it worked in different shelters in different states of Australia and get their feedback on it. So we had really good intentions, and so did they, but just due to practicalities and, you know, crazy stuff like bushfires and floods and puppy farm raids, they just weren't able to follow through with collecting that data. And so I went to a shelter local to me, and conducted that research myself. So when we implemented the BARC protocol into the shelter and followed up dogs after, what we found was that the retest reliability of the protocol was actually really good, but that was about it. So we followed dogs up between 6 weeks post-adoption up to around 8 months post-adoption, I think. And what we found was that behaviour was quite variable over time. And so that raised concerns because, you know, at the time, one of the common assessment subtests in an assessment that shelters would use is the food guarding test. So you might be familiar with the one with the fake hand, where we assess whether or not the dog shows aggression when you take a bowl of food away or place the fake hand near them while they're eating a treat. And that was a common reason, if a dog failed that subtest, that they may not be put up for adoption due to that aggression. And, you know, more recent research has actually shown that dogs that display resource guarding in a shelter context don't necessarily do it post-adoption, and vice versa. So what we know is that behaviour is so context specific. So accurately assessing behaviour in a shelter environment is really difficult. And when you add in the stress of that environment and the loss of the attachment bond for the dog and the novelty of it, it makes accurately assessing behaviour using a behaviour assessment protocol alone quite difficult. So in a nutshell, that's what my PhD found.
I think you raised a few really important points. Well, you raised many important points, but to kind of highlight a few of them, you know, a lot of assessments that are done, traditional assessments, whether they're done something that's developed in-house, or to use your own terminology, or something that's well established, you know, and even those assessments that have had some sort of validity or reliability established, you know, these tend to be provocative tests, which means, you know, what happens when you poke a dog? Well, you know, even if the dog's like a pretty easygoing guy, if you poke a dog, it's probably not going to be super happy. And if you poke him with something that's fake, a fake hand whilst he's eating, might not be the best idea and the best indicator of how well a dog copes. So yeah, I mean, there's just the fundamental nature of these assessments, I think, being provocative, trying to get these behaviors out. The other thing that you noted that I think is really important, so validity and reliability, of course, we as researchers are very familiar with them, but I am thinking that maybe people who aren't scientists might not be super familiar with them. I think whilst there are a number of different types of validity and reliability, I think in the case of these assessments, probably the most important is what you noted. It's their predictive validity. So how well what you're seeing in a shelter is predictive of the behavior not in the shelter.
Mm-hmm.
And as you noted in one of your papers, there are a few main reasons that organizations assess their dogs. Two of the big ones are a safety assessment, a risk assessment, and another big one, of course, is matching between potential adopter and dog. And then, of course, highlighting future needs for training. I feel like I've missed one. Anyway, but again, are what we seeing in the shelter, in this environment, is that what we're going to see post-adoption? And I think that's really at the heart of all of these assessments. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Because at the end of the day, people want to know when they go to a shelter, they want to pick a dog that's going to be a fantastic companion, a member of the family, essentially, these days. Mm-hmm. That's what dogs are to the majority of people. Mm-hmm. And in helping them achieve that, it's so important that we make a really great match. Mm-hmm. So matching dogs to potential adopters is super important. Mm-hmm. And pretty much one of the biggest aspects of that is matching their behavior to the new lifestyle and home that it's going to go to. So mm-hmm. Yeah, it's hard, and shelters do their best. They do their best mm-hmm. with the resources and the knowledge they have to try and do mm-hmm. that, but it's mm-hmm. not always easy for them or feasible. They're behaving in response to their environment, and mm-hmm. traditional shelters are built for ease of cleaning, and they're not. They're concrete pens. Mm-hmm. They're not necessarily great environments for dogs who may be noise sensitive, like a lot of working dogs are, or who are not familiar with that kind of environment, who are anxious. So it does make assessing their behavior really tricky. Yeah.
So from what you found in your research, how can shelters or rehoming organizations, because we're fully aware that not all dogs live in a shelter, live in a kennel before they are adopted. A lot live in foster homes, other environments. So based on what you found, what are kind of the takeaways for organizations?
Yeah, so I guess some of the biggest takeaways are not to rely too heavily on just the results of an assessment alone. Mm-hmm. You want to take into account as much information as you can to get the most accurate picture of any dog's behavior. So yes, the results of an assessment do provide you information with how that dog behaves within that context of the assessment. But you would also want to look at how does the dog behave in a vet clinic environment. So, during that dog's health check, or if it has to have any procedures done, collecting information about how it copes there is very useful for a potential adopter. Also trying to get some background information if you're able to, and that's not always possible, which can make matching really hard, because often this is the case here. Dogs will come from rural environments where they weren't socialized to city life at all, and an adopter might adopt a dog not knowing that it came from that environment, and then experience problems when they walk it, in a suburban environment, because the dog's fearful of trucks or kids on bikes or things like that. Foster care is an incredible model, I think, that has so much potential, and we really need to do more research in that area, because when a dog's in foster care, it's like it's in a normal home environment. So its behavior is going to be much more indicative living with its new owner during foster care in a home. So I think we really need to look at more, and shelters can look at incorporating a foster care program if they don't already, especially for dogs who may not be coping very well in the shelter environment. There are elements of the assessment that I found, and that other researchers have found, that can be reliable and predictive. So looking further at that and trying to refine and improve how assessments are done. But also providing follow-up support for new owners who may be experiencing problems with their newly adopted dog that weren't evident in the assessment or in the shelter environment. I think it's very much a holistic approach to try and make adoption successful for the dogs that come through.
based on your research, what do you think are the practical applications or implications for owners and for dog adopters? I mean, it depends on the organization, certainly, kind of what they do in terms of dog assessment. But, generally when someone is looking for a dog and they are going and meeting the dogs, and either there will be kind of a formalized sort of behavior report, or if it's a smaller organization, maybe just something anecdotal. And I'm wondering what you think, based on the results of your work, potential adopters or owners should keep in mind, when they get this pre-adoption behavioral information.
If they can get information about the dog's history, that can be really, really helpful, because that can provide clues on whether or not the dog was socialized in terms of the context that you'll be living in with the dog. So if you live in in an apartment building and there's lots of other people around, and you're in the city and you want a dog that you can take to dog parks, you want to make sure that you choose a dog that's well socialized with other dogs, or that you're prepared to work on that with them. And you also want a dog that's familiar with that kind of environment, or you want to know that that's not the case and be prepared to work on those things with your dog. So, some adopters are prepared to work on behavioural issues, but others are novice and they don't know how. And so, that fits into their lifestyle a lot more easier, is going to be better for them. So I think it's on the onus of the potential adopter to do their research and make sure that they choose a breed or breed type that fits really well with their living situation and lifestyle. So, a working dog in an apartment that's come from the country is probably not a good fit. But these are sorts of things that people should consider, that they don't always. And finding out as much information as you can about the particular dogs that you're interested in, to make sure that they are a good fit and that your expectations will be met, because I think having unrealistic expectations is also a problem. That can contribute to a breakdown in that bond between owner and dog.
Okay. Now something that we were talking about, my colleagues and I were talking about, is, also keeping in mind, even if you have all the information in the world, so you have, dog history, and you have kind of the behavioral input from the shelter, and you have all the information, do you think it's still worthwhile and useful, in the interest of all of this, of a successful relationship, so safety, dog welfare, etc.?
It's so important. Yes. Okay. I'm so glad you brought that up, because behavior it's context specific. A dog will react to its circumstances at every minute. So just because the dog has been child friendly in the shelter, if it goes into a new home and the child's pulling on its ears or jumping on its back, or taking its favorite toys or doing things like that, those are actions that could contribute to resource guiding. And if the dog values those things, you may get aggression. So yes, it is so important. I mean, I try and tell all my clients I have a list of books. If you want to learn more, please read these books.
Yeah, we're doing a whole thing on this, but no, you're absolutely right. And I think that, sending people home with all the information that they can gather, if possible, but also, erring on the side of caution, being mindful of management techniques. So our friends, the baby gates.
Yeah.
And
I still use up until very recently, I still use baby gates. We still use a crate for management in some situations. Like my boys are older now and they're much better with our rescue dog, Lenny. But if we have family or friends over with younger children, we will use that as a management tool. And Lenny's great in the crate. We've built a very positive association with that place. Being able to read its behavior and body language, to know when it's comfortable and when it's not, and to reduce any, issues.
For sure. So kind of one last bit. So based on the research that you've done, and I know it was a little while ago, what do you think are the best kind of directions for future research? Like, where do you think the research should go next?
So I think more research, as always, needs to be done on these assessment protocols that are being used, to try and refine them further, and improve them as much as we can. And something else that I forgot to mention earlier is within that shelter environment, incorporating enrichment and other things to help reduce or alleviate stress or anxiety so that you get a more accurate picture of dog behaviour. Those things can help as well. There are some shelters that do overnight programs with staff or volunteers where they'll get them out of the shelter into a home for a night or two every now and then. Are certainly worth investigating further to see. And there has been a little bit of research on that kind of thing, looking at stress reduction with shelter dogs, and it does work. So I think there's so much potential. There's a couple of TV shows that there's one on in Australia at the moment, and it's so good. It's called The Dog House, and what it does is matches people to dogs. They have this special area. It looks like a house with a backyard where they take the dogs and the potential adopters for a meet and greet. So they get to spend time, away from the stressful shelter environment in a more relaxing place. And I think that sort of thing can provide a clearer picture of dog behaviour. So all of these things could provide really important clues on how we more accurately assess dogs in that context, how we better match them to adopters, and how we improve their welfare while they're waiting for adoption.
Yeah, well, thank you. Is there anything else that you wanted to add that I haven't touched on that you think would be useful either for organizations?
I suppose that they should bear in mind, potential adopters should bear in mind that it's a snapshot of that dog's behaviour at that time. And that, with any pet, to be a responsible pet owner, it's work. Dogs aren't born knowing how to live in our world. And it's really our job to help them cope. So I guess to set realistic expectations for potential dog owners, when you adopt a dog, it isn't always happily ever after. It does require work. And so putting the time in to understand dogs, their behaviour, and how they learn.
Yeah, you've hit on so many of the points that I'm always going on about. Well, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure and an honor to talk to you because, like I said, when we were deciding, my colleagues and I at the Dog Rehoming Project, we were kind of deciding how to launch this objective of the project to disseminate research in an accessible and comprehensible manner. I have no shortage of papers that I've read and haven't gotten to yet. But I was thinking over where we wanted to start. What's the most useful? And it had to be your work.
Oh.
There was
so lovely.
And I thought, no, it has to start here. I can't even tell you how many times I cite or reference this paper, both in my actual scientific writing and just in conversation. So I think it's really important work. And again, what's important here is that we're taking the research and we're applying it, because otherwise, what's the point of it?
Yes.
So anyway,
I'm so grateful that for the work that you're doing, for getting this important research out there, because it's so true. Like, we spend years and years collecting this important information and making these discoveries, but unless it gets out into the world where it can help practically improve things, then what's the point? So yeah, thank you so much, Karen, for what you're doing.
So this will go in due course up on our website. And so that, hopefully people and organizations will watch. If you're interested, I don't know if you are, possibly for people to contact you if they have more specific questions about the work.
Yeah, absolutely. People are free to contact me.
Anyway, Kate, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And yeah, we look forward to I don't know if you're planning to do any more future research, but if so.
I would love to one day. I'll watch this space.
Right, well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Thank you, Karen. You take care.
You too. Bye.